Before we begin the video, if you've been getting value out of this channel, please consider supporting High Americana via Patreon, linked in the description. At $3,000 a month, you will help me make this a full-time job and can also request historical content to be made. Thank you. And now, a passage from the Hispanic American Historical Review by Lawrence F. Hill, Confederate Exiles to Brazil. The outcome of the Civil War in the United States left the Southern people in a state of desperation. Here and there, despondency was so great that individuals resorted to the extremity of taking their own lives, while in every community, discouragement made many eager to desert the land of their birth and to seek new homes in foreign climes. Although the number included in the latter class can never be known definitely, it is certain that the figure should be written large. A Southern correspondent of the New York Herald, reporting about 4 months after the surrender at Appomattox, estimated that upwards of 50,000 Southerners were ready to emigrate to Brazil alone, and that more would go in case of favorable reports by the agents who had been sent out to make examinations on conditions. The leading journals of the Brazilian Empire ventured to predict that 100,000 families of provident, virtuous, and intelligent people, chiefly from the states recently in rebellion, would seek homes in their country. A careful study will show that even the larger figure was not altogether fanciful. Furthermore, in addition to those who intended to go to Brazil, were those who contemplated expatriation by going to Mexico, Honduras, or Venezuela. But what were the reasons which impelled these people to desert their native land and begin life anew in a strange country? Although they varied greatly with different individuals and with diverse groups, in general, they can be placed under one heading: a desire to get out from under a government controlled by Brownlows and Yankees. It was felt that a government in such hands could not protect life, liberty, and property, much less conserve honor, chivalry, and purity, that inestimable trinity without which life is not worth living, and without which no community can be termed Christian. Those who expected to launch upon the new adventure, of course, had little to leave behind. Hostile armies had laid waste to their lands, destroyed their homes and other possessions, and left them penniless and bereaved. It was only natural that they should turn wistful eyes to the El Dorado of their hopes and attempt to restore their lost fortunes with a comparatively small expenditure of capital and labor. As large numbers of Confederates talked of going into voluntary exile, the editors of their papers gave them frequent warning that a positive decision would prove perilous. It was perhaps fortunate that notes of caution were sounded on every side, for this led those who could not be deterred from making the adventure to exercise greater precaution in formulating their plans. In this manner, the exodus was robbed of some of its precipitateness, if not some of its radicalness. As is usual in such movements, there were a few wiseacres who rushed off in headstrong fashion, but the vast majority who left the country acted after deliberation. One of the results of this deliberation was the formation of companies or associations throughout all the southern states, by means of which emigration was to be facilitated. Through these organizations, pertinent information was gathered and disseminated, and agents were dispatched to foreign lands to make all arrangements preliminary to settlement. To Brazil, the only land of exile with which this paper is concerned, the companies sent prospecting agents by the score. On arrival at Rio de Janeiro, these agents were accorded a welcome that was not soon forgotten. From the highest ministers of state, they received warm personal greetings, and from the bands which accompanied the processions, they heard their beloved Dixie once more. Yet the 3 or 4 days spent in the capital constituted hardly more than an introduction to the period of genuine cordiality which followed, for as the prospectors, accompanied by government engineers, interpreters, and guides, pursued their journeys through the various provinces, they found themselves continuously the honored guests of both town and countryside. They were truly convinced that all hospitality had not vanished from the earth with the surrender of General Lee. After 4 or 5 months spent at inspection, the agents chose the sites and returned to Rio de Janeiro to draw up the contracts providing the general terms of settlement. Through the contracts, the Brazilian government gave provisional titles to the colony sites, each of which usually aggregated over 500,000 acres, with a guarantee of permanent titles to the individual holders as soon as the purchase price had been paid, including the cost of surveying. The settler paid from 22 to 42 cents an acre for the farms which the associations marked out for them. In order to satisfy Anglo-Saxon thirst for self-government, each colony was to be permitted to elect its own association officials, consisting of a director and 7 other functionaries. As isolation seemed likely to present the greatest difficulty in the establishment of the settlements, the government pledged itself to connect each community with the railways by means of substantial wagon roads. In addition to these aids, Brazil agreed to help the immigrants reach their new homes by long-time loans for passage, by exempting their belongings from import duties, by furnishing board and lodging for 20 days on arrival at Rio de Janeiro, and by providing free transportation from the capital to their destinations. Finally, when established in the country, citizenship was to be conferred by the mere taking of an oath, and eternal exemption from military service was promised for the asking. At the same time, the Brazilian government was entertaining in regal fashion the representatives of the emigration associations and entering into liberal contracts for the introduction of colonists. It was also maintaining its own agents at various points in the United States for the purpose of acquainting discontented people with all the advantages which Brazil had to offer. Although there were several of these promoters active in the centers of large population, the 2 best known were Bocaiúva, stationed at New York, and Goicuria, stationed at New Orleans. These 2 propagandists appear to have been as vigorous in their activities as 20th century real estate agents. Amidst his routine duties, the former found time to call the editor of the New York Herald to task for alleging that the Brazilian government was not fulfilling its agreements with the emigrants, while the latter seemed no less devoted to the carrying out of his particular program. Through these American and Brazilian agents, which operated in each other's country, most of the arrangements were made for the emigration from the United States. After the signing of the contracts, which could take place in either Brazil or in the United States, the next problem was that of finding desirable people to make the venture. While there were always those who were willing to enlist in the enterprise, it was more difficult in the face of the adverse attitude of the newspapers, as well as of a few of the returning agents, to secure those whose experiences and possessions fitted them for the tasks to be confronted in the new country. Nevertheless, by means of advertisements in southern papers and by other means, considerable numbers were induced to try home building in Brazil. Included among the self-imposed exiles were people of almost every social and economic class then existing in the United States. There were generals, colonels, doctors, lawyers, merchants, planters, ministers, teachers, barroom loafers, bounty jumpers, and vagabonds. As it was later discovered, not all who went were American citizens, for some of the émigrés were of English and of Irish lineage and had never become naturalized. Although all available figures on the number of Southerners who left the United States to establish homes in Brazil during the 4 or 5 years subsequent to the close of the war represent hardly more than wild guesses, it is certain that the exodus never attained the proportions fixed in the imaginations of many people. A reporter of a New York paper estimated that about 1,800 left for the South American country during the first 6 months of 1867. But he fails to inform us as to the source of his information. Some of the immigrants themselves wrote that they lodged with 500 fellow countrymen at the Emigrant House in Rio de Janeiro en route to the settlements, though their statements also furnish a very insecure basis for estimates as to numbers. As late as September 1871, at which time a steady stream of disillusioned colonists had been flowing northward for many months, the United States minister to Brazil wrote his government that there remained in the province of Sao Paulo alone between 300 and 400 American families. This estimate is likely to be misleading, however, unless we are reminded that the success of the exiles in this province caused them to remain longer than at most places. Whatever may have been their number, the American exiles to Brazil established themselves from the province of Rio Grande in the south to the Amazonian province of Para in the north, or over a distance greater than that from Cape Cod to the Golden Gate. Instead of being uniformly distributed over this vast area, of course, most of them settled in a few colonies, chief of which were in Para, Espiritu Santo, and Sao Paulo. The hardships endured by the emigrants on the long and perilous voyages to South America seem comparable to the sufferings of those who came to the eastern shores of North America in the early 17th century. Unfortunately, the difficulties encountered on the voyage usually continued after landing, but perhaps a little particularization will better reveal the nature of the novel experiences. Among the interesting colonies in Brazil was that established on the middle Amazon in the province of Pará. The site, selected by the Confederate Major Lansford Warren Hastings, was at the mouth of the Tapajós River, a distance of 600 or 700 miles from the coast city of Pará. Not many months after the surrender at Appomattox, a company of Tennessee and Alabama planters, disgusted with the United States government, the defeat and everything connected with the country, assembled farming implements and provisions for 6 months at Montgomery, preparatory to a journey to Brazil as soon as their agent, the above-named major, should return with the announcement of a site. Hastings returned with the expected report, but before the completion of all arrangements for the departure, several months had passed. Notwithstanding the delay, the preparations seemed to have been inadequate, for the expedition came to grief and was compelled to return to Mobile. After another period of waiting, a second start was made toward the south. All went well for a while, but the repaired vessel was able to go no further than the island of St. Thomas, where the passengers were obliged to plead for space on a regular packet, which took them to Pará. From the provincial capital, the last lap of the long journey to Santarém was made in a river steamer. Thus, in September 1867, after 2 years of hope and anxiety, the first of the Hastings followers, numbering about 115 weary and downcast souls, reached the scene of their El Dorado, if such it remained. Although severe, the experiences before arrival were not more bitter than those yet to come. Only 6 miles of the road, which was to be constructed in order to make the little town of Santarém accessible to the colonists after settlement had been completed, and it became necessary to carry on foot over steep hills and through torrents of rain, baggage, and food distances of 10 and 15 miles. Hardly less onerous was the necessity of waging constant and costly warfare against fevers and dysentery, as well as against beasts, birds, reptiles, and insects which infested the land. The establishment of homes under such conditions would have challenged the mettle of hardy frontiersmen. The task was too great for the followers of Hastings, some of whom were old men, many others of whom had never done a full day's work, and all of whom knew nothing of the language they found it necessary to use. But to complete the story, we must add that the newcomers, most of whom were almost destitute on arrival, had to purchase their provisions in a market regulated by monopoly. Under the circumstances, it is not surprising that before the expiration of 6 months, many of the exiles were appealing to the American consul at Pará for relief. In the communications, they alleged that the Brazilian government had failed to carry out the terms of the contract entered into with Major Hastings in November 1866, and that to this fact was attributable much of the impending suffering. The consul gave the memorials early replies, placed them before the president of the province, by whom the contract had been negotiated and through whom relief was expected, and began an investigation. As a result of the examination into the charges, he induced the government to continue to supply the colonists with small sums of money for the purchase of provisions and to rescind the order of the local police, which prohibited them from removal from the site on the Tapajós, though he at the same time insisted on the colonists reimbursing the government for passage and for consumed provisions in case they contemplated leaving the country. Notwithstanding the relief measures provided through the provincial president, large numbers of the settlers found passage to Pará. Unfortunately, they failed to receive a hearty welcome there, for the consul's instructions prevented him furnishing provisions or transportation to the United States to any except those who fell in the class of distressed seamen. Nevertheless, through one means or another, most of the refugees managed to keep alive and eventually to return to their native land. Originating with the refugees and broadcast through their acquaintances and relatives, many of the newspapers of the United States carried the report that the Santarém colony was a complete failure. If the accounts of those who remained on the Amazon can be trusted, the report has another version, writing from Valley Home on May 24, 1868, to a friend in Tennessee that he had better pick up bag and baggage and come out and so get rid of Brownlow, Negroes, Yankees, and taxation. A Mr. Pitts remarked that the colony is in fine condition and doing well, and that there is no truth in the reports that the enterprise is a failure. To substantiate the general statement, he said further, I planted Brazilian corn in January and raised a fine crop, and have planted 3 times since. Will have an abundance to do me. I have sugarcane, cotton, pumpkins, squash, 5 kinds of sweet potatoes, Irish potatoes, cornfield peas, snap beans, butter beans, ochre, tomatoes, and a fine chance of tobacco. I have made enough to live well on, and am better pleased than ever. I have a great variety of fruits on my place. 16 months later, another resident of Santarém, Mrs. N.F. White, sounded the same note in a letter to an Alabama friend. The writer's husband appeared to be prospering in the manufacture of rum and molasses from cocoa and sugarcane, and the only bar to supreme contentment was the want of some of the ordinary institutions of society. Fortunately, prospects were bright for the future, for good families were arriving slowly and setting up their establishments. These apparently contradictory reports on the success of the Amazon venture can be explained by the fact that those emigrants who went without means and without a willingness to kiss the rod were soon disillusioned and ready to return home, while those who emigrated reasonably well supplied with money and endowed with energy settled down and became happy and contented. 300 miles north of Rio de Janeiro, in the province of Espiritu Santo, was a much larger and more prosperous colony of Southern exiles, given to Colonel Charles G. Gunter of Alabama, and consisting of several thousand acres. The grant was situated 30 miles above the mouth of the Rio Doce. In the heart of the tract, and embracing some 80 square miles, was the beautiful freshwater lake of Huparanau, about which 20 settlements were planted. Eastward from the lake, the level land extended back for several miles, while westward small arms of water reached a low range of distant mountains, through whose gaps could be seen towering peaks of still more remote ranges. To the spot thus endowed by the Creator, the Confederate colonel conducted exiles until there were upwards of 50 families, many of whom had left the Crescent City in the spring of 1867 with the expectation of settling in Reverend Dunn's colony in Sao Paulo. The families claimed Alabama, Florida, Louisiana, Mississippi, Texas, and Virginia as their former homes, and included many persons of education and refinement. But on arrival at their new homes, army officers, doctors, and lawyers laid aside their professions and entered the forests with the determination to succeed at the occupation of farming or perish in the attempt. Acting perhaps from a sense of duty rather than of pleasure, the women too caught the new spirit and performed manifold household tasks hitherto left to servants. In spite of the numerous handicaps and inconveniences incident to pioneering, such as monthly steamship service, canoe transportation, dwelling in single-room huts covered with palm in Mexican style and without door or window shutters, at the end of the first year, the settlers contrasted their own happy situation with that of friends and relatives in the homeland, for whom they offered many sincere prayers. This boasted contentment was no doubt sincere, for in its early history this was reputed to be the most successful of all the exile colonies. In addition to possessing a wise director, Lake Huparanau appears to have been peculiarly fortunate in the selection of its settlers. Since many of the Rio Doce settlers moved into the interior of Sao Paulo after a few years, it seems quite probable that the early prosperity did not have a long continuance.